At 65 years old, Jean-Claude Van Damme has finally decided that silence costs more than honesty. The man the world knows as the Muscles from Brussels has spent decades navigating Hollywood's unwritten rules. Smile for the cameras, protect the brand, and never pull back the curtain on your peers. But with the passing of Chuck Norris on March 19, 2026, Van Damme found himself carrying a truth too heavy to keep locked away. What he revealed wasn't a grudge, a rivalry, or a petty score to settle. It was something far more sobering. A raw, deeply human portrait of a man the world had collectively decided was not allowed to be human at all. Sitting in a dimly lit corner of a Brussels cafe, Van Damme looked nothing like the man who once performed the iconic split between two moving Volvos. At 65, his face carries every high kick, every film set explosion, and every hard-lived mile of a remarkable and turbulent life. There were no handlers present, no PR teams carefully curating his words, and no Hollywood smile plastered across his face. He looked, instead, like a man who had finally decided that the weight of an unspoken truth was heavier than anything he had ever lifted in a gym. When the name Chuck Norris entered the conversation, the atmosphere shifted entirely. Van Damme leaned forward, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the past, and began to dismantle one of the most carefully constructed legends in entertainment history, not with cruelty, but with grief. The revelation Van Damme shared was not about who would win in a real fight or which of the two men was the greater action star. It was something far more uncomfortable. He described Chuck Norris not as the invincible warrior the world worshipped, but as a man who had become a prisoner of his own legend. The meme-tier, godlike image of Norris, the one who doesn't age, he levels up, was, according to Van Damme, a golden cage that Norris had voluntarily locked himself inside, even as the walls began to close in around him. Chuck couldn't be human anymore, Van Damme whispered during his revelation. The world demanded a superhero, and he was too proud to tell them he was just a man who could bleed. What made this truth particularly devastating was the contrast it drew between the two men's approaches to fame and its inevitable consequences. Van Damme has spent the better part of the last decade being brutally transparent about his own struggles, his battles with addiction, his diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and the crushing psychological weight of being a global celebrity. He crashed publicly, he burned loudly, and then he rebuilt himself in full view of the world. Chuck Norris, by stark contrast, doubled down on the invincible image with every passing year. He remained a closed book, a stoic and unmoving statue who refused to show cracks, even as the foundation beneath him quietly crumbled. Van Damme recounted a specific, heartbreaking moment from their final year together. Norris in visible physical agony, his body finally rebelling against decades of punishing martial arts, yet refusing medical help or even the simple dignity of sitting down in a chair. The reason? Because the Chuck Norris the world believed in simply did not get hurt. To fully appreciate the tragedy Van Damme is describing, you have to travel back to the beginning, back before the blockbusters, before the memes, and before the myth had fully taken shape. When Jean-Claude Van Damme first arrived in Los Angeles, he was not a star. He was a skinny kid from Belgium with a thick accent, an extraordinary pair of legs, and a dream that nearly everyone in Hollywood laughed at. He was sleeping in his car, doing odd jobs, and desperately trying to convince anyone who would listen that he was the next Bruce Lee. The man who did not laugh was Chuck Norris. At the time, Norris was already a significant star, the undisputed king of the lone wolf action film. He owned a popular establishment called Woody's Wharf in Newport Beach, California, and he needed someone who could handle themselves if the nights got rough. He hired the young Belgian as a bouncer. The image is almost impossible to wrap your mind around. One of the most physically gifted martial artists in the world, a future Hollywood legend, standing outside a bar-checking identification. But Van Damme looks back on those nights with a deep sense of reverence. He wasn't just an employee, he was a student. Chuck Norris saw something genuine in him, a raw, explosive kicking ability that set him apart, and invited him to train as a sparring partner in his private gym. This was not Hollywood sparring, where punches are pulled and egos are protected. This was old-school, full-contact training conducted with the seriousness of a man who had won 6 consecutive world professional middleweight karate championships. Van Damme describes those sessions as a baptism by fire. Norris pushed him to the absolute edge of his physical capabilities, instilling in him the kind of iron discipline required not just to fight, but to translate that fighting ability into cinematic magic. It was Norris who gave Van Damme his first real foothold in the industry, helping him land a small role as a stuntman and extra in the 1984 film Missing in Action. For Van Damme, Chuck Norris was not just a boss or a trainer. He was a godfather figure, the blueprint for what a martial arts superstar could and should be. But as the late 80s gave way to the 90s, the dynamic between them began to shift. Van Damme's career detonated with Bloodsport and Kickboxer. The student had become a rival, and Hollywood, as small and ruthless as it is, can only accommodate so many kings at the top of the mountain. While they never engaged in a public feud, the distance between them began to grow quietly and steadily. Van Damme became the face of a new school of action cinema, flashier, more emotional, more willing to be chaotic and unpredictable both on screen and off. Norris, meanwhile, cemented his persona as the ultimate stoic American lawman through 9 seasons of Walker, Texas Ranger, a role that would define his legacy for an entirely new generation of fans. The chasm between them became most visible when they were finally reunited on screen in The Expendables 2. Van Damme recalls that the atmosphere on set changed the moment Norris arrived. While Stallone, Schwarzenegger, and Willis were laughing about their ages and leaning into the comfortable absurdity of their shared legacy, Norris remained apart. He had his own rules, his own carefully maintained aura. Van Damme looked at his old mentor and did not see the man who had once sweated alongside him in a Newport Beach gym. He saw a man who had become a statue of himself. "I wanted to hug him," Van Damme admitted. "I wanted to say, hey, remember when we were just 2 guys kicking a heavy bag? But you couldn't get close to him." He was Chuck Norris now. He wasn't Chuck anymore. The legend of Chuck Norris was, in its origins, built on something genuinely extraordinary. Born Carlos Ray Norris on March 10, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, he entered the world in the most precarious way possible, born blue, his lungs refusing to cooperate, spending his first days simply fighting to survive. It was a grim foreshadowing and a strange irony for the man who would become the world's defining symbol of physical invincibility. His childhood was defined not by strength but by struggle, poverty, instability, and a father whose severe alcoholism forced young Carlos into the role of man of the house far too early. By his own admission, he was not athletic, not popular, and deeply introverted. He was the kid who sat on the bench, who was bullied, who felt invisible. Everything changed when he joined the U.S. Air Force in 1958 and was stationed in South Korea, where he discovered Tang Soo Do. In the discipline of martial arts, Carlos Norris found the one thing his childhood had never given him, a sense of complete control. He trained with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, earned his black belt, and returned to the United States to open a chain of karate schools. He wasn't simply learning to fight. He was constructing a version of himself that was bulletproof, a version that his absent father could never wound and that no bully could ever touch again. By the time he was winning world championships and catching the attention of Hollywood, he had buried the shy, scrawny kid from Oklahoma under layers of muscle, discipline, and an impenetrable persona. This is the psychological core of the truth Van Damme is trying to share. The armor Chuck Norris built was not vanity, it was survival. It was the only way he knew how to exist in the world after a childhood that had left him feeling fundamentally inadequate. The problem, as Van Damme gently but painfully observes, is that the armor eventually became indistinguishable from a man himself. When the internet erupted with Chuck Norris facts in the mid-2000s, turning him into a digital deity of impossible toughness, the cage became permanent. The world stopped seeing a human being who aged, who ached, who faced the same quiet terror of mortality as everyone else. They saw the meme. They saw the man who levels up instead of growing old. And Chuck Norris, rather than pushing back against this dehumanizing mythology, leaned into it. Because he had spent his entire life running from the alternative, Van Damme tried, in the closing chapter of their friendship, to reach through the wall. He wanted to tell Chuck that it was acceptable to be 86 and fragile. He wanted to assure him that the fans who loved the legend would love the man just as deeply, perhaps more so, if he simply allowed himself to be seen as human. But the wall Norris had built over 8 decades was too high and too thick to breach. Their relationship had devolved into a series of polite nods at conventions and misconnections, a hollow shadow of the intense bond forged between a bouncer and his boss in the sweat-soaked reality of early 80s Los Angeles. When Chuck Norris passed away in Hawaii on March 19, 2026, 9 days after posting a birthday video of himself sparring in the Hawaiian sun and cheerfully declaring, "I don't age, I level up," the world erupted in grief and celebration simultaneously. Stallone called him all-American in every way. Schwarzenegger declared his legend would live forever. The internet processed its loss in the only language it knew for Norris, with impossible, affectionate humor. But Van Damme's tribute carried a weight the others did not. He saw not just the icon the world was mourning, but the man he had tried and failed to reach, the shy kid from Oklahoma who had spent 86 years proving to the world, and perhaps to himself, that he was never that vulnerable again. Van Damme's revelation is not an attack on a legend. It is a eulogy for a friendship that quietly died long before the man himself did, sacrificed on the altar of an image that left no room for vulnerability, warmth, or the simple human dignity of admitting you are tired. It is a warning, delivered with heartbreak rather than judgment, about the cost of becoming a symbol. It forces us to look at those old VHS tapes differently, to see the high kicks as slightly heavier and the stoic glares as something closer to a plea. Chuck Norris built one of the most extraordinary lives in the history of popular culture, rising from poverty and invisibility to become a genuine global icon. But in doing so, he lost something irreplaceable, the freedom to simply be a man. Jean-Claude Van Damme is the sole witness to the cracks in that armor. And now he carries those truths alone, hoping that in telling them, the world might finally love the man as much as it always loved the myth.